An Arab prince arrived for an important meeting, but the interpreter never showed up. Negotiations were falling apart, and the staff was panicking. Then, an elderly cleaning lady, whom everyone laughed at, suddenly spoke in fluent Arabic. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The first rays of a pale winter sun crept over the skyline of New York City, painting long shadows across the frozen streets. At the far end of the JFK airport complex, a battered city bus came to a halt in a cloud of steam and brake dust. Its doors hissed open, and among the handful of commuters who stepped onto the icy pavement was a small, stooped woman bundled in a coat that had clearly seen many seasons. She moved slowly, cautiously, as though each footstep was an act of deliberate patience rather than fatigue. Her name was Martha Wilkins. 78 years old, African American, with a frame diminished by time but carried with quiet pride. Her uniform, standard issue for contracted janitorial staff, was clean but threadbare, the stitching around the shoulders beginning to loosen. She wore her gray hair tucked beneath a knitted cap, her hands protected by thin gloves that left her fingertips numb despite the effort. Every morning, Martha arrived before most of the terminal staff, not out of necessity or assignment, but because she believed in starting quietly. She preferred to see the space empty before the clamor began, to greet the silence with mop and rag and the dignity of unspoken routine. Inside Terminal 4, the concourse slowly stirred to life. Security staff grumbled over bitter coffee. Airline clerks wheeled carts of promotional materials toward their booths, and supervisors barked into radios, their voices crackling through the intercoms. In the midst of this organized chaos, Martha moved like a whisper, unnoticed by most, acknowledged by none. She entered through the service corridor and made her way to the employee lockers. Her movements were slow but economical. She folded her coat carefully, placed her knit cap in her cubby, and tied her apron with hands that trembled only slightly. A faded plastic badge bearing her name and employee number dangled from a retractable cord. She clipped it to her breast pocket and straightened it once, then again, as though it might finally grant her some recognition among the indifferent gazes she passed each day. Her first task was the glass. The wide, panoramic windows lining the VIP lounge on the mezzanine level had to be cleaned before any guests arrived. No fingerprints, no smudges. She carried a small worn cart with her supplies, a squeegee, a spray bottle of vinegar solution, a stack of lint-free towels. Each item was placed just so, its position memorized through years of repetition. As she knelt to clean the lower panes, a pair of security guards strolled past, not even glancing her way. By 8:30, the lounge would begin to fill with the early trickle of executive travelers. Men in tailored suits speaking into Bluetooth headsets, women with sleek luggage and expressions carved from steel. They would settle into armchairs with their laptops and imported bottled water, barely glancing up when she entered the room to empty a trash can or realign a misplaced chair. It was always the same. They didn't see her. The younger staff, event coordinators, floor attendants, catering supervisors were polite in the most impersonal way. Some greeted her with mechanical nods. Others issued curt commands with forced smiles. Most ignored her entirely. One girl, barely out of college and eager to impress, had once said with exasperation, "She's always hovering like a ghost. Can't she mop somewhere else?" The comment had stung, but Martha had kept her head down and continued working. Her supervisor, Carl Henderson, was a different matter entirely. In his mid-40s, tall, broad-shouldered, with a combed-back wave of graying blonde hair and a Rolex that he liked to adjust in meetings, Carl fancied himself a manager of excellence. He liked systems, control, and credit. Martha was none of those things to him. She was background, a moving fixture in the scenery he curated for guests who actually mattered. When he spoke to her, it was with clipped words and narrowed eyes. "Stay out of sight when the VIPs arrive," he had reminded her just last week. They didn't pay to see cleaning staff. And so she complied. She always did. Not because she feared him or lacked pride, but because it was easier. She had learned long ago that peace came not from confrontation, but from patience. Her presence, though minimized, was necessary. The chairs were always straightened, the cups always replaced. The scent in the restrooms never unpleasant. She did not require praise to continue doing what was right. By 10, Martha was replenishing the water cooler near the executive lounge. She moved silently, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. A trio of assistants scurried past, speaking in low voices about a shipment delay. As she worked, her eyes scanned the headlines of a discarded newspaper lying on a side table. It was in Arabic. She paused briefly. The headline was poorly translated, an error in idiom that would have amused her husband. With a faint smile, she tore off a piece of receipt paper from her cart and scribbled the corrected version in neat, elegant script. Then she slipped it between the pages and folded the paper closed. Few knew that Martha could read Arabic. Fewer still knew she once spoke it fluently. That she once stood beside ambassadors in Cairo and Riyadh, serving tea with perfect pronunciation, listening to the cadences of diplomacy unfold like music. But that was long ago, before she walked away, before the stroke took her husband's speech, and later his life. Now, the only remnants of that world were kept in a dusty box beneath her bed. Photographs of embassies and banquets, letters from officials written in 3 languages, a pair of golden cufflinks she couldn't bear to part with, and her own silence. At lunch, Martha sat in the break room alone, as usual. She unwrapped a simple meal, a boiled egg, a piece of cornbread, and an apple. Her co-workers laughed loudly on the other side of the room, discussing weekend plans and online dating. Nobody sat near her. She didn't mind. There was comfort in solitude. She thought about her husband, about how much he had loved airports, how he would lean over the railing to watch planes take off, calling each one by its make and model. They used to travel frequently. Europe, the Middle East, North Africa. Back when she wore navy blue uniforms and low heels, her hair pinned tight beneath a stewardess's cap. Those days were a different life. Now she found peace in polishing chrome railings and wiping away invisible fingerprints. There was a rhythm to it, a simplicity. She didn't need to be remembered. She only needed the quiet satisfaction of a clean surface and a job done right. Near the end of her shift, a new hire approached her, a young white man with nervous eyes and a clipboard. He didn't know her name. "Hey, miss, can you grab that spill in front of gate 14? Someone said it's sticky." She nodded and stood without a word. "No, thank you. No, please. Just orders." As she mopped, she watched the reflection of a plane rising beyond the wide glass, a white arc cutting through the blue-gray sky. For a moment, her hand paused on the handle. Her chest tightened with something unspoken. Then she pressed the mop forward again. By the time the lounge lights dimmed for the evening, Martha had finished her rounds. She returned her cart to the janitorial closet, washed her hands slowly, and retrieved her coat. Her bus would arrive in 20 minutes. enough time for one last walk down the concourse, where the distant echo of boarding calls rang like memories from long ago. She passed the same security guard who never looked up from his phone, the same assistant manager who gave her a perfunctory nod, the same posters advertising luxury travel, spa services, and first-class champagne. No one stopped her. No one thanked her. No one knew that the woman quietly locking the supply closet had once been entrusted with secrets of state and conversations that shifted the course of trade between nations. No one noticed the invisible figure. Not yet. By the following morning, a different kind of chill had settled over the airport, not from the weather outside, but from something subtler, heavier. The air inside Terminal 4 seemed taut with pressure, as if the walls themselves were bracing for something unseen. There were no announcements, no alarms, yet everyone from the operations supervisors to the janitorial team seemed to move with a certain alertness, their steps brisker, their glances sharper, their voices just a bit lower. It began before sunrise in the dimly lit office above the VIP concourse, where Carl Henderson stood in front of a large whiteboard, clutching a clipboard, flanked by two junior supervisors. His brow was furrowed, his jaw tight. The memo he had received at 4 a.m. still sat open on his desk, bearing the seal of the Department of International Economic Affairs. A high-level delegation from the Kingdom of Khazir, a powerful Middle Eastern oil state, would be arriving at JFK that afternoon on a private diplomatic aircraft. The head of the delegation was none other than His Royal Highness, Prince Tariq al-Hamadi, a figure known both for his influence and for his unforgiving standards. This was no ceremonial visit. It was the quiet preamble to a potential energy negotiation with U.S. officials, contracts worth billions in oil, infrastructure, and investment. Carl knew what this meant. Every minute of the prince's visit would be under scrutiny, and any mistake, however minor, could ripple far beyond the walls of the terminal. The weight of it settled heavily on his shoulders. In theory, the infrastructure was in place. The VIP lounge was equipped with everything it needed, the catering service had been briefed, and a professional translator had been arranged by the embassy. But in Carl's world, nothing was ever guaranteed. Downstairs, the hustle had already begun. Uniformed staff moved about with a mix of urgency and confusion. Deliveries were signed for without being checked. A nervous intern dropped a tray of glasses near the service elevator and was scolded so harshly she nearly cried. Amid it all, Martha Wilkins clocked in precisely at 6 a.m., just as she always did. The hallway lights flickered slightly as she walked past the staff entrance, nodding politely at a half-asleep guard who gave her no acknowledgement in return. She went straight to her closet, changed into her uniform, and wheeled out her cleaning cart with quiet efficiency. The halls were already a half-step more chaotic than usual. She could sense it in the way people brushed past her, not bothering to excuse themselves. They were too preoccupied to even notice the woman they'd long ago learned to ignore. As she polished the brass trim along the concierge desk in the VIP lounge, she overheard one of the junior managers muttering into his headset. "We need more Evian stocked in the South Cabinet, and someone make sure the Moroccan dates are actually from Morocco this time." Another voice responded, frazzled. "And the prayer mats, where are they? I told purchasing 3 times. Martha continued her work quietly. She could feel it building, the tension, the creeping sense that something was bound to unravel. She recognized it not because she'd seen it here before, but because it reminded her of another kind of chaos, diplomatic chaos. The kind that started with missed formalities and ended with broken alliances. At 8:30, Carl descended upon the lounge like a man preparing for war. He strode through the space with a permanent frown etched across his face, adjusting the cuffs of his blazer every few minutes, as though even his sleeves needed to reflect authority. He barked instructions to the catering team, questioned the floral arrangements, and demanded someone double-check the temperature of the room. He glanced toward Martha, who was polishing the base of a lamp, and snapped, "Stay out of the lounge after 11. I don't want you in the background when they get here." "Yes, sir," she replied simply, not bothering to meet his eyes. She was used to that tone by now. It didn't matter that she knew this lounge better than any of the suited supervisors rushing around. She had watched every inch of it for the past decade. How the carpets wore down in the corners, where the ceiling vents tended to rattle, which glass doors caught streaks in the afternoon light. But none of that counted. Not when the world saw her only as the one who emptied trash cans and wiped countertops. By noon, the storm had truly gathered. The lounge had been transformed into a showroom of controlled elegance. The silverware gleamed, the armchairs were arranged at strategic angles, and the central table was adorned with fresh fruit, delicate pastries, and 2 French press carafes of single-origin coffee. Still, Carl wasn't satisfied. "What about the translator?" he asked a woman from the embassy staff, his voice pitched just a little too loudly. "He should be en route. He left the hotel an hour ago," she replied. "That's not good enough," Carl hissed. "I want confirmation he's in the building before wheels down." But no confirmation came. Outside, snow had begun to fall lightly, dusting the tarmac in soft white. The weather reports were suddenly full of delays and rerouted flights, and somewhere in the city, stuck on the wrong side of a frozen overpass, the translator's car sat motionless in a line of blinking hazard lights. Inside, the mood shifted further. The staff grew quieter, more careful. Carl paced. His radio buzzed with updates that offered no comfort. Martha, meanwhile, had moved to the side hallway and was wiping down the frosted glass along the perimeter. She had been told to stay away from the central lounge, so she worked around the edges, humming a tune softly under her breath, one she hadn't heard since her Cairo days. No one noticed. Shortly after 1 p.m., Carl received the call he had been dreading. The translator would not arrive on time. Snow, stalled traffic, a closed highway. He listened to the embassy liaison, try to soften the blow, but his mind was already racing. "This can't happen," he muttered to himself after ending the call. "This is not happening." He convened his team and issued instructions. "We stall, smile, nod, offer them drinks. Most of these guys speak English. It'll be fine." A young assistant hesitated. "But what if they insist on speaking Arabic?" "Then smile harder," Carl snapped. "We're not amateurs. We make them feel welcome." It was bravado, but nothing more. Martha, nearby, overheard the entire exchange. She paused with her cloth halfway across the glass and felt a strange sensation bloom in her chest. Recognition. Not of the people or the language being spoken, but of the stakes. She knew what it meant to fail diplomatically, knew how small missteps could become monumental. She could already see it. This wasn't just a storm. It was the beginning of a rupture. As the hour crept toward 2 p.m., final preparations accelerated. The staff rehearsed greetings. Everyone was in uniform, name tags aligned, postures straightened. The aroma of imported tea and cardamom pastries began to drift from the kitchen. The lounge sparkled under soft lighting, waiting like a stage set for a play no one had rehearsed fully. And through it all, Martha cleaned, quietly, deliberately. But her mind was not on the smudges or the fingerprints now. It was on the language she hadn't spoken aloud in years, on the delicate pronunciations of welcome, on the subtle bow of respect, on the small cultural cues that signaled dignity. Her lips moved silently as she replayed phrases in her head. Her hands moved out of habit, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. Carl, for his part, avoided eye contact with her now. Not because he suspected anything, but because in his fraying world, Martha had become yet another moving piece he couldn't control. Just another detail he didn't have time to notice. At exactly 2:17 p.m., a call came through the intercom. The delegation has entered airport perimeter. Estimated arrival at lounge in 6 minutes. The air turned electric. Martha stepped back into the shadows as instructed. She folded her cloth neatly and tucked it into the side pocket of her apron. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her cart, but her thoughts were far from cleaning. Outside, the sound of idling engines grew louder. Then doors opened, footsteps echoed, and the security detail stepped into view. The storm had arrived. The moment the gilded glass doors of the VIP lounge slid open and the delegation stepped inside. A hush fell across the room so complete it might have belonged to a cathedral. Every conversation halted mid-sentence, every motion slowed as though the air itself had thickened. Prince Tariq al-Hamadi, heir to one of the most influential oil dynasties in the world, entered with an elegant confidence that commanded attention without demanding it. Flanked by 2 advisors in tailored gray suits and a security detail dressed in crisp black, he walked with measured calm toward the central seating area. Carl Henderson, who had positioned himself precisely 6 feet from the entryway to make the optimal first impression, stepped forward with a practiced smile stretched tightly across his face. "Your Highness, welcome to New York. It is our honor to receive you," he said in English, bowing slightly and gesturing toward the seating area, adorned with imported fruit, French pastries, and polished silver. The prince did not speak. He barely nodded, glancing at the arrangements without expression before settling into one of the low armchairs. His advisors followed suit, exchanging brief murmurs in Arabic as they adjusted their posture. The security men took up their positions discreetly behind him, eyes sweeping the room in silence. Carl waited a beat longer, then added, "We've arranged refreshments to your specifications and have ensured the environment meets your hospitality standards." Still no answer. The advisors continued speaking among themselves, their tones too low for Carl to discern but clearly inquisitive. One of them gestured towards the central table, tapping a silver serving spoon with 2 fingers. The prince looked toward his assistant and spoke softly, but his voice carried. It was clear he had asked a question. Carl leaned in, attempting to catch the gist, but the words fell foreign on his ears. One of the advisors looked up expectantly. Carl straightened, cleared his throat, and tried again. "Yes, everything you requested is here. We hope your trip was smooth." The advisor tilted his head as though waiting for something more. Then he asked, very deliberately, "Where is the translator?" Carl hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. "Delayed," he said quickly. "He was caught in traffic, but it's no problem. We're happy to accommodate in English. Or, French, if that's preferable." The advisor turned to Prince Tariq and relayed the message. The prince said nothing. His dark eyes lingered on Carl for a moment, then shifted away. A faint tension crept into the room. It was subtle at first, no more than a silence held a second too long, but it deepened when the second advisor, an older man with a trimmed beard and narrow eyes, began to speak in Arabic with a sharper tone. Carl recognized the cadence of concern, though not the words. The advisor's voice dropped at the end of his sentence, but his brow remained furrowed. He motioned to one of the servers, pointing at a coffee pot, and said something curtly. The server froze. Carl moved quickly toward the table, seized the pot himself, and poured the coffee, smiling too hard, his hands slightly trembling. "Black? No sugar?" he asked. The advisor raised an eyebrow, not understanding. Then came the first real shift. The older advisor leaned toward the prince and said something clipped, pointed. The prince did not respond, but his fingers tapped once sharply on the glass tabletop. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. Carl's voice cracked slightly as he attempted damage control. "We sincerely apologize for the delay in translation. We're working to resolve." Before he could finish, the second advisor leaned back and said something else, louder now, his voice low and disdainful. It was a direct critique of the service, of the organization, perhaps even of Carl himself. The words fell like small stones in a well. No one moved. Carl's smile collapsed. "I understand there's a concern," he said, trying to maintain composure. "Please be assured that," more Arabic, this time sharper, unmistakably dismissive. The prince remained calm, but his body language shifted, just enough for the room to feel it. His eyes moved from Carl to the table, to the servers, then finally towards the glass wall where Martha Wilkins stood quietly with her cleaning cart, observing. In the corner, a staff member fumbled with his tablet, trying to pull up an app that might help translate. Another began to text someone off-site. The entire room began to unravel in slow motion. Carl took a breath and spoke into his earpiece, voice low but increasingly panicked. "Has anyone located the translator yet?" "No update," came the reply, still stuck on the BQE. The prince rose slightly, his eyes scanning the room. Then he said something calmly in Arabic, 3 short words. The older advisor translated for Carl in English. "This is unacceptable." That was the fracture, the moment of failure. Carl's face drained of color. He turned to the staff, eyes wide, grasping for someone to blame. His gaze settled on a young assistant standing near the refreshment table. "You were supposed to monitor comms. You said he was on the way," Carl snapped. I only relayed what I was told," the assistant began. Carl didn't wait. He turned to the catering manager. "Why weren't you informed? Why wasn't this escalated sooner?" But no one responded. The staff stood still, all eyes now shifting toward Carl and then, almost in unison, toward Martha, who had begun quietly retreating with her cart toward the hallway. "Hey," Carl said, pointing at her, "didn't you just come from the back hallway? Did you see the translator out there?" Martha stopped. "No," she said calmly, her voice quiet. Carl gestured dismissively. "Then keep moving. This is not your area." The second advisor spoke again, this time directly to Carl. It was a warning, even if Carl didn't understand the words. The prince had not touched his drink, nor the food. His presence in the room now felt less like a guest and more like a judgment. And then came the sharpest moment of all. The prince spoke again. Short, cold, the advisor turned and translated, "We will depart shortly. Please inform your government representative that this meeting has failed." Carl tried to protest, his hands raised in supplication. "Please, Your Highness, we ask only for a moment's patience, I assure you, we—" But the words died in his throat. Behind him, Martha had not moved. She stood in place, her hands resting on the cart handle. Her face was calm, but something behind her eyes had awakened, something long dormant. She had seen this exact dynamic before. The moment when diplomacy failed, not because of intention, but because of carelessness, blindness, and arrogance. She watched Carl flail, watched the advisors exchange murmurs, watched the staff shrink into corners, helpless and silent. She saw in the prince's expression a subtle shift, not anger, but disappointment. And something else. Resignation. Martha's fingers twitched, not out of fear, but memory. She recalled standing behind a minister's wife in Ankara during a dinner where the interpreter collapsed from heat exhaustion. She had stepped forward then, too, almost without thinking. Back then, her hair was black, her skirt suit navy, and her voice firm. She remembered the heat of the stage lights, the scent of rosewater, and the look of recognition on the ambassador's face when she spoke his language. Now, she stood in an apron with scuffed shoes and aching knees. But her voice still remained. She didn't speak, not yet. But the moment was almost upon her. The room was seconds from total collapse. The meeting was about to be deemed a diplomatic failure. And no one in that room had the words to stop it. Except her. The silence that hung over the lounge was nearly unbearable. It was the kind of silence that spoke louder than any reprimand, a silence that hollowed out the air and made every movement feel like a violation. Carl stood frozen near the table, his hand half raised in a desperate gesture he hadn't finished. The advisors were murmuring to one another in Arabic, their expressions a mix of disapproval and irritation, while the prince sat still as stone, eyes lowered toward the untouched refreshments. The staff had receded into the corners of the room like shadows withdrawn at dusk. Even those who had never been afraid of Carl before now seemed reluctant to move. The failure was undeniable, its consequences already looming. It would not just be Carl's reputation that suffered. It would be the terminals, perhaps the cities. News of diplomatic disrespect traveled swiftly and lingered long. It was in that vacuum of helplessness that a soft voice emerged, so gently spoken that no one responded at first. "Excuse me," the voice said again, firmer this time, yet still respectful, still composed. Carl turned sharply. The advisors paused mid-sentence. All heads turned toward the side hallway where Martha stood, no longer hiding behind her cart, but no more assertive than usual. She held a silver tray in both hands, balanced perfectly, her back straight, her steps even. "I understand," she said in clear, melodic Arabic, "that you prefer herbal tea and medjool dates. May I offer these with respect as a welcome to your journey?" A breath caught in someone's throat. The room was still, entirely still. Carl's eyes widened in disbelief, but his voice failed him. The older advisor's brows lifted slightly. He looked towards the prince, who regarded Martha with a new expression, measured but curious. He spoke briefly, quietly, and the advisor nodded once before translating. "You speak Arabic?" he asked her, switching to English for Carl's benefit. Martha answered directly in Arabic, with the ease of someone who hadn't merely studied the language but had lived in it. "I do. I served in diplomatic hospitality for many years." She stepped forward and placed the tray on the edge of the low table in front of the prince. The tea's fragrant steam rose gently in the space between them. Her every movement was precise, dignified, not rehearsed, remembered. The prince looked at her hands. They were steady. He nodded once and picked up the porcelain cup, inhaling the scent before taking a small sip. Then another. He set it down carefully and looked at her again, this time with the slightest curve to his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but it wasn't far. The older advisor murmured something in Arabic, and the younger one let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like relief. The tension cracked just slightly. One of the staff members by the far wall lowered her shoulders as if she'd been holding her breath. Carl took a step forward. "This is Yes, she's one of our support staff. We're very proud of our multicultural team, he said, forcing a grin. Martha did not look at him. Her eyes were on the prince. The prince spoke again, slowly this time, as though trying to understand not just her words, but her presence. "What is your name?" he asked in Arabic. "Martha Wilkins," she replied, "though when I worked in Cairo, I was often called Miriam." A beat passed. Then the prince chuckled, low and smooth. "Then Miriam, it is," he said. The staff around the room didn't understand the exchange, but they didn't need to. The change in the room was palpable. The silence now was a different kind, one of awe. Carl stood off to the side, uncertain whether to reassert his control or retreat. He opened his mouth, but the prince spoke again. "I would like to speak with her," he said. The older advisor translated the request into English. Carl blinked. "Of course, Your Highness. I'll arrange for a room, a private—" "No," the prince interrupted softly. "Here is fine." Martha, ever poised, inclined her head. "I would be honored." They sat across from one another, not as servant and sovereign, but as equals. The prince gestured toward the tea. "You remembered how I like it." She smiled. "It is a courtesy I was taught to never forget." And then they spoke. Not about treaties or policies, but about places and people. He asked where she had worked, and she told him. In Cairo, in Amman, in Abu Dhabi. He asked if she still followed the political changes in the region. She nodded, citing names, recalling events, placing herself firmly in a timeline he knew well. When he spoke of his father's reforms, she responded with insight and respect. When he mentioned his recent tour of educational centers, she shared a brief story of helping a diplomat's daughter with her French pronunciation during a state visit to Paris. It was not just a conversation, it was an exchange of memory and recognition, a weaving of two lives through a common thread of service and understanding. At one point, she made a small joke, nothing forced, nothing flashy, just a simple comment about airport tea never being strong enough, and the prince laughed. Not politely, not out of obligation, but with genuine mirth. The advisors glanced at one another, their postures softening. The tension that had nearly ruined the visit dissipated into something warmer, something human. Carl stood rooted in place. He looked at the director of the terminal who had entered minutes before, summoned by the unfolding crisis. The director said nothing, just watched. Martha's tone remained steady, gracious. She neither overstepped nor diminished herself. She did what she had always done best. Built bridges, not through grand speeches, but through humility, cultural fluency, and presence. She embodied what hospitality was meant to be, not choreographed, but sincere. Eventually, the prince stood. He looked around the room once more, then back at Martha. He spoke in Arabic, and this time his voice carried. "This woman has shown me more understanding in 5 minutes than I have received in 5 years of meetings." Then, switching to English, he added for the benefit of those present, "This is what respect looks like." He turned to the older advisor and spoke a final instruction. The man nodded and stepped forward, removing a slim envelope from his coat. He handed it to Martha with both hands. Inside was a personal letter of thanks, written in Arabic, and a gilded calling card bearing the seal of the royal household. "Should you ever wish to visit our country," the advisor said, "you will be welcomed as a guest of the prince himself." Martha bowed slightly. "That is a kindness I will never forget." The prince offered one last nod, then turned toward the exit. His entourage followed, but not before both advisors gave Martha a nod of respect, and one of the guards even placed a hand over his heart as he passed. As the doors closed behind them, the room remained silent. Not awkwardly so, but reverently. Then someone whispered, "What just happened?" Another voice replied, "She saved the entire thing. That's what happened." Carl looked down at his shoes. He had no words. Martha turned toward her cart, took a deep breath, and began to gather her supplies. She was already back in motion, already returning to the role she'd worn so long. But something had changed. It was not the role that had changed. It was how everyone now saw it. How everyone now saw her. The woman they had never noticed had become, in a single afternoon, the one person no one could forget. The following morning, the hush that lingered over Terminal 4 was not the nervous kind that had filled the lounge before Prince Tariq's arrival. It was a quieter, more curious silence, the kind that followed a revelation, the kind that waited for certainty to take shape. Whispers had already begun to stir in the corridors before the first pot of coffee brewed. Something had happened during the prince's visit, something unexpected. Not the catastrophic failure that many had feared, but something else entirely. A shift, a turn, a story too remarkable to ignore. Carl Henderson arrived just after dawn, dressed sharply in his navy blazer and silk tie, with a confidence more manufactured than felt. He entered the administrative wing with a stack of neatly bound reports in hand, ready to spin the previous day's disaster into a personal success. He had been up late rewriting the narrative, reframing the near-diplomatic collapse as a moment of adaptive leadership, of creative improvisation under pressure. Now, as he stood outside the conference room on the 7th floor, waiting to meet with Director Yamaguchi, he rehearsed his lines under his breath, polishing each sentence with practiced finesse. When the door opened, the director did not greet him with a smile. He was a tall, restrained man with a demeanor that inspired silence. He simply gestured for Carl to enter. The room was bare, save for a tablet on the table, a few folders, and a half-full cup of coffee cooling at the edge of a paper coaster. Carl took a seat, offered his preliminary remarks, and launched into the version of events he had prepared so carefully. "We were informed late of the translator's delay," he began, his voice firm and confident. "Naturally, I assessed the risk and directed staff to maintain full hospitality standards which, under the circumstances, I believe we executed to the best of our ability. The prince was, as I understand it, quite satisfied by the end of the visit. I think it speaks to the efficiency of our training program and the flexibility of our team under pressure." He paused for effect, awaiting a nod of approval or at least a request for elaboration. None came. Instead, Director Yamaguchi reached for the tablet and tapped the screen. Without a word, he turned the screen to face Carl. The video began to play, security camera footage from the VIP lounge. It showed the entire sequence, the failed introductions, Carl's panicked attempts to communicate, the moment when the advisors nearly left, and then Martha. There she was, small and steady, stepping forward, her voice calm and fluid in Arabic. The room transformed around her. The tension lifted. The prince smiled, laughed, spoke with warmth. It was undeniable. Carl's throat tightened. He hadn't realized how much had been captured. He had assumed the cameras were off, or at least pointed in the wrong direction. Now, in crisp detail, they were bearing witness to a truth he had tried to bend. When the video ended, Director Yamaguchi didn't speak immediately. He picked up a folder and placed it on the table. Inside were handwritten accounts from the staff, testimonies collected the night before. "Every member of your team was interviewed," the director said quietly. "Every one of them attributed the success of the prince's visit to one individual. not you." Carl felt a prickling sensation at the back of his neck. "They also mentioned," the director continued, "that you attempted to shift blame when things began to go wrong, that you singled out junior employees, that you dismissed Miss Wilkins before she acted, and attempted to reclaim credit after she succeeded." Carl opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Director Yamaguchi closed the folder and folded his hands. "Effective immediately. You're being reassigned. You will no longer serve as supervisor for the VIP lounge." The words fell with absolute finality. Carl's shoulders slumped, his palms damp against his lap. He wanted to protest. He wanted to explain that it hadn't been malice, just panic. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had seen an opportunity to elevate himself, and he had done so at the expense of the very person who saved them all. Outside the room, just down the corridor, the buzz had already begun. Staff clustered in small groups, talking in low voices, checking their phones. One had pulled up an old article from an aviation history blog. There, in black and white, was a younger Martha Wilkins, dressed in formal diplomatic uniform, standing beside the U.S. ambassador in Cairo, smiling graciously for the camera. The caption read, "Martha Wilkins, the unsung diplomat of the skies." She had been there the whole time, cleaning their coffee stains, picking up after their meetings, watching as they looked past her, day after day. The realization swept through the staff like a tide. The woman they had called Miss Janitor behind her back, whom they'd sent to mop up after minor spills without so much as a thank you, had once stood at the center of rooms where the fate of international cooperation was being decided. And when the moment came, when they had faltered and flailed, she had not hesitated to do what none of them could. Later that afternoon, as the lounge settled back into its usual rhythm, a new kind of energy filled the space. Conversations paused as Martha entered the room. She wore the same uniform, pushed the same cart, moved with the same unassuming grace. But something was different now. A young assistant, one who had barely acknowledged her the day before, stepped forward and said, "Good afternoon, Miss Wilkins." His voice carried a tremor of respect. Martha gave a small smile. "Afternoon." Others followed suit, offering quiet greetings, holding open doors, clearing space as she passed. It wasn't grand or overblown. It was human. Real. By the time Director Yamaguchi stepped into the lounge with several team leads in tow, the atmosphere had changed entirely. He cleared his throat and called for attention. "In light of recent events," he began, "the administration has reviewed protocols and responses during the prince's visit. We have concluded that one individual demonstrated the highest level of cultural intelligence, diplomacy, and grace under pressure. That individual is Miss Martha Wilkins." Heads turned. Martha paused, hands resting lightly on her cart. "Effective today," the director continued, "Miss Wilkins is being appointed Cultural Hospitality Advisor to Terminal 4. She will lead workshops in cross-cultural etiquette and serve as a consultant for international delegation planning. Her knowledge and experience are not only invaluable, they are exemplary." There was a soft wave of applause. It wasn't thunderous, but it was warm, sincere. Martha looked down at her hands, then back at the people around her. For a moment, she was speechless. "I'm honored," she said finally, "but I'm still going to mop the floors." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, but no one mistook her words for modesty. They were a quiet assertion of identity, of continuity. She wasn't rejecting the recognition, only reminding them that dignity didn't require elevation. She had always held it. They just hadn't seen it before. As the group began to disperse, one of the younger staff members approached her. "Miss Wilkins, if it's all right, could I ask you something?" Martha turned. "Of course. Why cleaning? After everything you did, why this job?" Martha considered the question. She looked out toward the window, where the afternoon sun cast long golden beams across the tarmac. "I did the big things already," she said softly. "I traveled the world. I met presidents, shook hands with royalty, but after my husband passed, I just wanted a place that felt simple, familiar." She paused. "This terminal, this was where he always met me after assignments. We'd watch planes together. He loved the smell of jet fuel, said it smelled like purpose." The young man listened, eyes wide. "Cleaning," she continued, "gives me peace. When I clean something, I know I've made it better, even if no one notices. And sometimes when the world is too noisy, that's enough." Her words weren't poetic. They didn't need to be. They carried the weight of a life lived fully, quietly, and with grace. That evening, as the last light faded beyond the skyline, Martha stayed late to finish polishing the silver in the lounge. Not because anyone asked her to, because she wanted to, because she took pride in leaving the place ready for tomorrow. As she wheeled her cart back to the storage room, she passed by a staff bulletin board newly adorned with a framed printout of her old photo, the one from Cairo, and beneath it a quote she had not written, but which someone had attributed to her. "True hospitality is not what you wear or what you serve. It is what you remember about others and what you make them remember about themselves." And that night, for the first time in years, Martha Wilkins left the terminal not as the woman everyone overlooked, but as the one they all now followed. A few days later, the air in Terminal 4 held a different quality. Not quite celebratory, not quite ordinary, but touched with something unmistakably new. The steady rhythm of the airport had resumed its tempo. Flights arrived and departed. Announcements chimed across the speaker system. Rolling luggage echoed along the polished floors. But beneath it all, there was an undercurrent of attention that now followed Martha Wilkins wherever she went. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real, and it was constant. That morning, as the sky over Queens blushed faintly with winter light, Martha arrived for her shift at the usual time. She stepped off the bus, her steps measured and familiar, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. She still preferred to arrive early. The terminal, in its quieter state, still felt like home, a sacred moment before the crowds and engines swallowed the calm. Yet, even in the stillness, she sensed that something awaited her. When she stepped through the service entrance, she saw them. A small group of colleagues gathered just outside the break room, standing not with their usual distracted posture, but in a line, expectant. A young supervisor, barely 30, stepped forward with a garment bag and a small box in hand. "Good morning, Miss Wilkins," he said with a hesitant smile. She paused. "Good morning. We have something for you." From the bag he produced a new uniform. Still modest, still practical, but tailored and pressed to perfection. The insignia on the chest bore her name, stitched in fine gold thread, and beneath it a new title: Cultural Hospitality Advisor. The box contained a polished name badge with the same words engraved. Martha blinked. "Is this?" "It's from the head office," the supervisor replied. "They'd like you to begin working with the training division. Orientation for international etiquette, cross-cultural sensitivity, service with respect. You're already a model of all of it, so they figured, Who better to teach? Martha looked down at the fabric in her hands, then at the faces around her. These were the same people who used to walk past her without so much as a glance. And now they stood before her with a quiet kind of reverence, waiting for her response. "I'm not sure I know how to teach," she said slowly. "You already did," the young man said. "We just weren't listening." She smiled faintly and nodded. "Well then, I suppose I should get changed." That day, she stepped into the lounge not as a cleaner, not as a background figure, but as a woman recognized for who she was. Her uniform still bore the shape of utility, but its meaning had been altered. It was no longer invisible. It was emblematic. Staff members greeted her with warmth. Guests, even those who had not been there during the prince's visit, sensed something distinct in her presence, and the younger employees, once so eager to distance themselves from her work, now paid close attention to her routines. They watched the way she arranged the furniture, how she spoke to travelers, how she listened more than she spoke. By early afternoon, a cluster of new recruits followed her from station to station, mimicking her gestures, asking quiet questions. She didn't give lectures. She didn't write manuals. She simply showed them how to see people. "You walk slowly, Miss Wilkins," one of them observed with a grin. "Helps me see more," she replied. They laughed, and she laughed too. In the staff kitchen, someone had printed her photo from the Cairo days and tacked it on the bulletin board beside notes and flight rosters. Above the image, someone had written in marker, "Diplomat, teacher, colleague." No one called her the cleaning lady anymore. Around mid-afternoon, a package arrived for her. It was addressed in elegant handwriting and sealed with the royal crest of the Kingdom of Khazir. Inside was a note on fine parchment. "Dear Miss Wilkins, it was an honor to meet you. Your presence reminded me that dignity transcends ceremony, and that true diplomacy often comes from unexpected places. Should you ever wish to visit our country, know that our gates are open to you as a friend. In gratitude, Tariq bin Salman al-Hamadi." Below the signature was a line handwritten in Arabic. "Hospitality lives not in palaces, but in people." Martha folded the note carefully and placed it in her purse. She did not show it to anyone. Some things didn't need to be shared to be cherished. That evening, the sun dipped low beyond the runways, casting long shadows across the tarmac. The terminal glowed with golden light, and from the window of the VIP lounge, Martha could see the silhouette of a large aircraft lifting into the sky, its engines rumbling like a promise. She stood alone for a moment, watching the flight disappear beyond the horizon. Then she returned to her duties. There were cups to collect, chairs to align, details to tend to. She still moved slowly, still carried a cloth in her hand, still preferred silence over fanfare. But something had shifted, not in her, but around her. The staff no longer passed by without a glance. They stopped to greet her, to ask her opinion, to walk beside her. The supervisors no longer whispered commands, they asked. And the newest employees, those who had arrived just that week, had already heard stories. They looked at her the way one might look at a monument not for its size, but for its meaning. Later that week, she was invited to speak at a staff-wide seminar, an informal gathering meant to promote excellence in service. She was hesitant at first. Public speaking had never been her strength, but she accepted. She stood before a room of 50 employees, some older than her, most much younger, all watching her in complete silence. She didn't use slides or bullet points. She didn't rehearse. "I won't tell you how to serve tea properly," she began. "You can learn that from a book." A few chuckled softly. "What I will tell you is this. people remember how you made them feel, long after they forget your name, your uniform, your title. They remember if you saw them, if you treated them as people first. She paused. It's not about rank. It's not about language. It's about attention. That's all. When she stepped down, no one clapped immediately. The room was too quiet, too thoughtful. Then, one by one, they began to rise. Later that night, long after the seminar had ended and the terminal had quieted again, Martha lingered in the lounge. The floor was clean. The chairs were aligned. The scent of jasmine tea still clung faintly to the air. On the television monitor mounted in the corner, a muted documentary played for the few remaining travelers still waiting for delayed flights. The subtitles read, "True hospitality isn't about protocol. It's about presence." She smiled at that. As she turned off the lights and walked down the hallway, her steps echoed softly behind her. At the far end, near the staff elevator, someone had placed a plaque on the wall. It was small and simple, no larger than a sheet of paper. It read, "In honor of Martha Wilkins, who reminded us what it means to see with grace and serve it with heart." She paused before it for a moment, then turned away, her silhouette cast long across the polished tile as she moved. Outside, a new plane lifted into the darkening sky, its lights blinking steadily as it disappeared into the clouds. And inside the terminal, the voice that once went unheard now lingered in every hallway, not as an echo, but as a lesson, quiet, steadfast, and enduring. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what's coming next. Watch our other stories for more powerful moments like this, and share this video with someone who needs to see it.